While science can and must correct itself when new discoveries are made, if the new findings contradict a theory, that theory is effectively falsified. By contrast, a good scientific theory must make accurate predictions to be validated. Therefore, one of the core characteristics of all scientific theories is their testability. Another way of saying they must have good predictive power. In this video, we are going to present not one, not two, but 9 failed predictions of the theory of evolution, erroneous bets that were placed on central concepts to evolution. Let's dive in from the least impactful to the most egregious of all. Number 9. Darwin's pagenesys hypothesis. In 1968, Darwin proposed a theory of heredity called pagenesys in his work The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication. He hypothesized that tiny, invisible particles called gemmules were produced in every part of the body, each containing information about the state and changes of that part that they came from. For example, if somebody was a blacksmith with very well-developed muscles, their gemmules would reflect that. He further envisioned these gemmules traveling through the bloodstream to reach the reproductive organs where they accumulated in the sperm or egg cells. During reproduction, the gemmules from each parent would mix, transmitting traits from both parents to the offspring. His theory allowed for a significant portion of Lamarckian inheritance of acquired traits to actually work. The interesting thing is that 2 years before this, Gregor Mendel had published his landmark scientific studies on plant hybridization. It's not entirely clear whether Darwin read Mendel's work or not, but regardless, his predictions about how hereditary traits are transmitted were proven to be completely wrong. Of note in this context is the obvious fact that while Mendel was a very meticulous scientist, conducting experiments, doing measurements, drawing conclusions based on the findings in those experiments, Darwin preferred to base his conclusions largely on his own philosophical speculations, and did not bother to perform real-world experiments, even when they were feasible, with the exception of a handful of experiments on worms and plants, most of which were observational in nature. Number 8. Vestigial organs. There was a time when the human appendix, coccyx, and a few other organs were considered vestigial. Vestigial structures were seen as evidence of ancestral traits passed on to modern species, some of which had no use for the leftover traits and thus had them underdeveloped. Over numerous generations, the useless body parts would eventually vanish, and research has been conducted with the aim of determining how useful or useless the appendix, for example, is. The appendix has been found to play a role in mammalian mucosal immune function. It is believed to be involved in extrathymically derived T lymphocyte and B lymphocyte mediated immune responses. It is also said to produce early defenses that help prevent serious infections in humans. In addition to this, the appendix serves as a reservoir of healthy gut bacteria that can replenish the gut in cases of severe diarrhea. It has and still is taught in school that the human coccyx, or the tailbone, is a vestigial organ. But it is a well-known fact that the coccyx serves useful functions. For example, the coccyx is like one leg of a tripod that evenly distributes your weight to keep you stable when sitting down. It works with the pointed sections of your pelvis, the ischial spines, to support your body weight when you're sitting. While it is still argued that the appendix and other so-called vestigial organs are less useful than their ancestral counterparts, this does not eliminate the reality of the false prediction that some of these structures would be completely vestigial or without any function. Number 7. Ape-like Neanderthals. Neanderthal depictions are another example of how enthusiastic early predictions based on Darwinian evolution have gradually been revised as new data has been collected. Initially, scientists depicted these creatures with fur, protruding snouts, receding foreheads, and an overall appearance that looked a lot more like apes than humans. Nowadays, they are portrayed as creatures much more like modern humans. In addition, archaeological data shows that they were good at painting, hunting, decorating the graves of loved ones, making musical instruments, even making glue underground. So much for Haeckel's suggesting the name Homo stupidus for Neanderthals. In addition, an increasing number of scientists are accepting the idea that they interbred with what are considered modern humans. Therefore, using the biological species concept, the BSC, which defines a species as a population of organisms that can interbreed, Neanderthals and humans are both Homo sapiens. It is true that the discovered Neanderthals have some differences in their morphology, such as the eyebrow ridges, which are more exaggerated than most humans today. However, the morphological species concept, the MSC, is not the most widely used definition of species because no two individuals are the same. Some people, like Nikolai Valuev, for example, have pronounced ridges, and yet they are undeniably still humans. Number 6. Phylogenetic trees. Trees made by Darwin, Haeckel, and other famous evolutionary biologists predicted that new life forms arose from common ancestors, ultimately leading to Luca, or the last universal common ancestor. Wherever that was thought to have happened, a split-off point was drawn on the tree. Because of common ancestry theory, phylogenetics also predicted species to be more related to each other if they originated from the same common ancestor than if each came from different ancestors. When genetic sequences between species were later compared, the similarities did not align with what early trees illustrated. Since the genome of any given organism is directly responsible for the makeup of that organism, it should, in terms of relatedness, relay the same message as the history of ancestry. But the fact that genomes don't do that is problematic for evolution. Please check our recent video on phylogenetic trees for more about this topic. Number 5. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In addition to creating fancy phylogenetic trees, Ernst Haeckel also came up with the famous law of ontogeny, according to which the early development of an organism, the ontogeny, repeats its evolutionary history, the phylogeny. More specifically, he claimed that embryos of higher organisms pass through stages resembling the adult forms of their evolutionary ancestors. He went on to create detailed plates with drawings of embryos of various species, including human ones, with features that appear to show them passing through stages resembling fish, reptiles, and then mammals. This was taught as a fundamental law of evolution and development. And I remember how my histology professor in the second year of medical school in Romania insisted on this issue as if it was the most important thing to remember from that class. Not too long after, it became apparent that Haeckel grossly misrepresented the images of those embryos, omitting, for example, the heart bulge of humans, or making the branchial folds in the neck area look like fish gills. The latter are simply folds of embryonic tissue that go on to develop into the various structures of the neck of that creature. They never function as gills. And yet, it is today widely recognized that this was a fraud, as illustrated in this book by Nick Hopwood, Haeckel's Embryos, Images, Evolution, and Fraud. No serious scientist upholds this law today, though you can still find Haeckel's embryo drawings in many high school textbooks. Number 4. The linear evolution of man. You all remember what is likely the best known symbol of evolution, the succession of a small ape followed by a slightly taller ape and smarter looking apes after that, progressing through increasingly human-like creatures until a modern man ends the series. Well, if you don't know already, this image is no longer thought to be an accurate representation of how things happened. Now, instead of a smooth, nice transition from one species to another, we are told multiple lines of ape ape-like and then hominin species evolved in parallel. The simple fact that various fossils thought to be part of this series could not be consistently dated and placed on that time continuum. Just think of all the time wasted in schools learning about this series. Number 3, gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Darwin famously wrote in his book on the origin of species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But, he concluded, I can find no such case. He fully expected that as more data would accumulate, his idea of gradualism would be fully validated. The problem is, the opposite happened. The more fossils were unearthed, the clearer it has become that there are obvious gaps between various species, and that the much sought after intermediate or missing links are still missing. This reality eventually led Stephen Jay Gould, a prominent evolutionary biologist and paleontologist, to claim that evolution happened exactly the opposite way Darwin envisioned it. He stated the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. He went on to propose the famous punctuated equilibrium hypothesis, which creates a situation in which evolution now wants to simultaneously eat the cake and have it too. No mechanism for punctuated equilibrium has been shown, and it is an even more difficult burden to prove than gradualism. Number 2, junk DNA. Not long after the discovery of DNA, it became apparent that only a small percentage, perhaps less than 2%, of our genetic letters coded for proteins. The evolution theory proponents jumped at the opportunity to provide what was thought to be a great answer to the question of what the rest 98+% of our DNA is doing. It must be the sandbox in which random mutations constantly generate new genetic material that gets picked up by natural selection as soon as something useful, that is something that provides a fitness or survival advantage, is produced. For several decades, this was taught as fact until 2012, when the major findings from the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, or the ENCODE project, were published. The main finding of ENCODE: over 80% of the human genome exhibits biochemical activity, suggesting that much more of our DNA is functionally relevant than previously believed. Vast stretches of this DNA play crucial regulatory and structural functions, are involved in DNA repair and many other functions. The final percentage is likely even higher. It is interesting to note, I think, in this context, a couple of things. First, the reaction of the most activist evolutionists has been to go from an initial state of shock and denial to ultimately an attempt to split the hairs and claim that biochemical activity is not the same as biological function. This is a trend that can be found again and again in evolution literature. When new data challenges prior assumptions, instead of accepting the new data, terms are being redefined, and even the definition of science is updated if needs be. Second, I'd like to invite you to think how much further we would be today if we have invested in studying these so-called junk DNA a few decades earlier. Chances are we would have already discovered cures for some genetic conditions and a whole host of other marvelous discoveries. But if you think something is junk, there isn't much value for discovery there, and you just don't study it. And our honorable mentions, soft tissue and fossils. In 2005, the scientific world was in shock when Dr. Mary Schweitzer published evidence of soft, stretchy tissue that resembled blood vessels in the femur of a Tyrannosaurus rex, estimated to be about 68 million years old. She also found convincing evidence of red blood cells and bone cells in those same samples. Her initial reaction of disbelief was typical of the consensus among scientists at the time. She stated,
I was scared to death. I had goosebumps, and I told my tech, I said, this isn't real. This can't happen. Do it again. We did it, I think, 17 times before I was ready to go public.
Many of her colleagues were extremely skeptical, even dismissive, claiming her findings were the result of contamination or biological films. Since then, soft tissue and even DNA have been found in many other fossils, some dating back as much as 500 million years ago to the Cambrian epoch, according to the evolutionary timescale. It is now accepted that these are tissues belonging to the original animals. I am aware of attempts to explain this incredible fact of organic matter lasting hundreds of millions of years by invoking iron and other factors. But I want you to take a moment and honestly appreciate the gigantic step of faith necessary to accept that muscle fibers, blood, bone cells, and other tissues from creatures that lived 60 million years ago and some over 500 million years ago somehow survived all this time. Number one, the ratio between beneficial and deleterious mutations. In 1932, Haldane wrote in his book, The Causes of Evolution, most mutations lead to a loss of complexity or a reduction in the size of some organ. And most evolutionary change has been degenerative. The other co-founders of neo-Darwinism, or the modern synthesis, Fisher and Wright, similarly predicted that most mutations were deleterious and thus easily weeded out by natural selection as envisioned by Darwin. Moto Kimura, however, in 1968 showed that most mutations are neutral or near neutral, and thus natural selection is not the dominant force at the molecular level because it cannot see these mutations, making it necessary to invoke rescue devices like genetic drift to try to save the theory. This is a larger problem for evolution than it seems at first sight, because these near neutral mutations, while not visible to natural selection, are allowed to accumulate in the genome, and over many generations they cause a loss of fitness, eventually leading to extinction and a veritable genetic burden. In addition, while early estimates by Mueller predicted that the rate of deleterious mutations was less than 0.12 or 0.3 per person per generation, later findings found a rate of 2 to 3 mutations per person per generation, about 10 times higher. But it gets even worse. Beneficial mutations are exceedingly rare, about 1 in 1,000, and potentially as bad as 1 in 1,000,000. And their benefit usually involves breaking down a part of a working cellular system, almost never the creation of new structures and functions. You get a picture in which things really go down rather than up overall. We only had time to cover 10 of many failed predictions of the evolution theory. Our intention is not to criticize or attack this theory. We're just pointing out important facts that are often kept from the public's attention, with the hope that you will allow your mind to stretch out a little bit and incorporate them into your library of information about evolution. There was not sufficient time to cover in detail any of these failed predictions. We plan to create a separate video in the future for each one of them, so stay tuned for that.